Here we go. Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the City of Everett Planning Commission. Today is Tuesday, September 17th, 2019. Could we have roll call, please?
Chair Beck,
Here.
Commissioner Lavra. Here. Commissioner Holland.
Here.
Commissioner Tisdale.
Here.
Commissioner Zelinski.
Here.
Commissioner Yanasak.
Here.
Commissioner McGinn. Here. Commissioner Finch.
Here.
Okay, has everybody had an opportunity to read the minutes? Does anybody have any comments or changes they would like to make to the minutes? Would anyone like to move to adopt the minutes?
I move that we adopt the minutes
Second.
for the September 3rd meeting. Excuse me.
Commissioner McGinn.
Yes.
Commissioner Yanasak.
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski.
Yes.
Commissioner Tisdale.
Yes.
Commissioner Holland.
Yes.
Commissioner Lavra.
Yes.
Chair Beck.
Yes. Okay, we'll just move down the line. Commissioner Finch, do you have any reports?
No report.
No report.
I don't have a report, but I did want to maybe let everybody know that I do have kind of an emerging potential childcare issue going on. So my wife's going to text me a little bit. I may need to bow out of the meeting a little early this evening. But so if I do get up, it might be around 8 o'clock. That would be why. I'll
Thanks.
try not to
Thank
be
you.
disruptive.
Yeah.
No report.
No report.
No report for me this evening.
No report?
And no report for me as well. So, staff comments?
Yes, Alan Giffen, Planning Department. The October 1st meeting will be canceled. We will meet next on the October 15th. Third Tuesday night of October will be our next meeting, so nothing in 2 weeks. That's it.
Okay, so at this time, we will open public comment on any item that is not listed on the agenda. Let me be clear, this is your time to inform Planning Commission of any concerns you may have on city topics, policies, or projects which are not on the evening's agenda. Once Planning Commission moves forward from the general citizen comment item, all other comments need to be specific to the agenda topic. Tonight's workshop will only address matters related to the publicly advertised, thank you, supportive housing policy. In addition, please treat each speaker with respect. Demonstrations in support or opposition to a comment or idea made at the podium are not appropriate. Public speaking is not an easy task for all of us, for some of us. Yeah, exactly. We want everyone to feel comfortable expressing their concerns uninterrupted. So at this time, would anybody like to speak to the Planning Commission on anything that is not on the agenda? Okay, without further ado, we'll hit item number 1.
Good evening, Alan Giffen, Planning Director. Tonight's meeting is a public workshop to discuss the supportive housing code that was the subject of a moratorium referred to the Planning Commission by the City Council. Before I get into the meat of the staff memo here, I'll just talk a little bit about what is in the staff packet before I get into the detail. At the August 20th Planning Commission meeting, the Commission had asked for some options on the items that had been referred by the City Council, and those are, I'll cover in a moment. But within the packet, there are a number of things that I'm not going to really discuss much, but wanted to point them out to you. So after the main part of the packet, the first 8 pages, I do have some graphics here, and the first 4 aerial photos I will talk about during the my presentation. The remaining aerial photos are of areas that are commercial and multifamily zoned properties that could be viable sites for supportive housing, that the Commission had asked for that information. They're not the subject of the moratorium, so I'm not really going to delve into any details about those properties. But they're just in there as information in your packet at your request at the last meeting. There was also a request for some information that had been brought up about the effect of affordable properties, affordable housing on property values. Somebody had made reference to a housing presentation that had been made at the Housing Consortium, one of the Housing Consortium conferences recently. We've attached the information that had been referenced to the back of that packet. That just doesn't have a lot or nothing specific to supportive housing. It's just something that was requested, I believe it was by one of the commissioners at the last workshop. And then there was also a reference made by one of the people in the audience to some 2018 legislation that I provided a link for you in your packet on page 8 that is regarding a policy adopted by the state legislature that surplus properties should be prioritized for development of affordable housing. Again, that's affordable housing, that's not specifically supportive housing. So there was a link provided there to that legislation. So I'm not going to cover those tonight unless you have questions, and if you do, I may not be able to answer those questions anyway, but that information was requested. What I'm going to focus on is really the options that we've laid out in response to the request by the Commission for the items that have been referred by the City Council.
I'm sorry, let's staff, there'll be a time for public comment. Is this an emergency?
I think the point of clarification that needs to be made before Mr. Giffen gets into his topics. The question, sir, is there's been a little bit of confusion over 500 feet from supportive housing and a half mile to supportive housing for bus service. Just if that can become clear, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I would like to point out that tonight is not a hearing on the Norton site owned by the Everett School District. I will point out that November 19th, we will hold a public hearing on the Housing Hope application for a comprehensive plan amendment and rezone that's been submitted for that site. And so would ask that comments related to the merits of that proposal be held until the November 19th public hearing as part of our normal annual docket process for the comprehensive plan. So I do not have a PowerPoint for you tonight, so we'll just walk through the packet. I'll try to point out what page I'm on as I address the individual points. And again, the purpose is to review the options that you had requested that we have identified in response to the specific items that the City Council has referred to you. Our next Planning Commission meeting on this topic will be October 15th, at which we will advertise as a public hearing unless something transpires tonight in which you tell me that you're not ready to make a decision at that meeting, but that's what we anticipate being made. I would also like to point out that we did receive some correspondence on this item from Fred Safstrom of Housing Hope. He provided some comments related to the existing code. I see Mr. Safstrom here tonight, and he may want to comment on his comments related to the current code. So, just as a reminder, the City Council enacted a moratorium on June 12th related to supportive housing within single-family zones. The supportive housing is allowed also in multifamily and commercial zones. Their moratorium does not affect the regulations and the process within multifamily or commercial zones, just single-family zones. Within single-family zones, the code allows supportive housing only on land owned by a public agency. The Commission did ask at the last meeting for just an estimate of the number of properties that would really affect within the city that could be viable sites for supportive housing. under the current regulation. And so that's when I will refer to the graphics that start on the 9th page of the packet after the main memorandum. There are 4 sites that staff identified that using the criteria for 500, being within 500 feet of transit, and we didn't measure from transit stops, we just measured from transit routes, which could be a little bit more than 500 feet from a transit stop, but when we reviewed all of the publicly owned parcels in single-family zones within 500 feet of a transit route, we identified, there were a number of parcels, but several of them most of them really fell off the table in terms of consideration for any kind of use, because they're either things like a wetland or a detention pond or something that is highly unlikely to be surplus, like a fire station or a public school or a park. There were some properties that we did identify that are open spaces, or in one case developed with housing, but at a fairly low density that might make it viable for redeveloping at a higher density under the current regulations that are the subject of the moratorium. So those 4 properties, 2 of them are located within the Fort Gardner neighborhood, 2 of them are located in the Madison neighborhood. One, of course, is the site on Norton that is the one that brought the matter to the attention of the City Council when they enacted the moratorium. The second one is just up the street a little ways on Grand Avenue. It's a property that has got split zoning, both R1 and R3 zoning, and it's at 35th and Grand. It's a little school district-owned property that is used as a park in the neighborhood. The 2 properties within the Madison neighborhood, one is it's kind of split by Brookridge Boulevard within the Madison neighborhood. I don't remember the name of the development that created punched Brookridge through probably 25 years ago there, but those properties are probably, one of them is probably not large enough to accommodate it, but there is one that is, and I haven't personally visited this site to see if that has wetland conditions on it. I'm guessing it may have, but it does have some developable land, but probably not likely to accommodate a lot of development. And then there was one on where Madison becomes Glenwood Avenue, property owned by the Everett Housing Authority that has some duplexes on it, but is large enough that it might be viable to redevelop with a higher density supportive housing project under the current code. So those were the 4 properties that we could identify that might have some potential to become supportive housing under the current regulations that are the subject of the moratorium. Even if you expanded the transit distance from 500 feet to a quarter-mile walking distance, it really did not pick up any more properties that were likely to be viable for development of anything, just because of the same reasons for the disqualifying the ones, well, either in undevelopable sites or things that are not going to change from their current use. So those, I hope that answers the question that the Commission had about the likely impact of leaving the regulations intact. So if you did leave them intact, then there's not a whole lot of impact throughout the community. There would be potentially impact in 2 neighborhoods, and those are the neighborhoods I just mentioned. So with that, I will go to down at the bottom of page 1 of the staff memo and the options that have been identified by the City Council. So option 1 was to allow supportive housing in single-family zones, but with standards that are consistent with the character of a single-family zone. And so the options that we had identified were option A, keep the current code to allow supportive housing in single-family zones, but only on publicly owned land using the hearing, exam, and review process, or eliminate single-family zone properties from the code as zones where supportive housing could be developed. Something's missing there. What I am going to suggest as I walk through these is, at least with this first option, that you keep both options on the table, because you're going to be having a public hearing on that on October 15th, whether or not to allow supportive housing in single-family zones on the publicly owned properties. As we go through the other items here, you may want to express some preferences, and we can frame those specific issues for a recommendation on your October 15th meeting, based upon the feedback that you get from the public tonight and that you provide to staff after that public feedback. So the what I would suggest is that, again, just leaving those two options open and answering that question on the at the October 15th meeting.
I'm going to pause you there and see, does commission have any questions at this point on this particular option, A and B for number 1? Okay.
I guess I do have a question about density. In looking at the 4 single-family sites, did staff come up with a likely density if they were to be developed per their current code?
No, we didn't do that type of analysis on those sites as to how many dwelling units could be developed under their current zoning as just the standard single-family or duplex or townhouses, whatever zone that is.
Okay. I mean, the reason I bring it up is because if I look at the single-family zone property in contrast with the other property that you've provided the exhibits on, it strikes me that there is, 5 to 6 times the development capacity in the other property, the non-residential property, than there exists in the single-family property. So I think that part of this discussion at some point should be, are we trying to find a way to make it acceptable in single-family when we have more than enough capacity in non-residential property, non-single-family property?
You're not looking for an answer from me?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So I'll then, if it's okay with the commission, move on to the second option. And that is the type of supportive housing and management models, management plan requirements for each. And the way I understood the city council to be framing that question was, should we have a general requirement, as the current code does, that a management plan would be provided with each application, or should there be a more definitive description in the code of what should be contained within a management plan for different types of supportive housing? So, for example, the difference between low barrier housing, the difference and, say, supportive housing for people with physical disabilities, or some other reason that they're in need of supportive housing. And so we provided some comments there, and the staff comment is that, in my opinion, the current requirement in the code allows us enough flexibility to get all the information we need for a supportive housing proposal through the review process. It's not necessarily to get into more definition of what should be contained within a management plan for a supportive housing project. So that's just my opinion, and you can talk about that more, I guess, after you hear from the public. Item 3, unless you have questions about item 2, item 3 was about public notice earlier in the process. We've identified a couple of options. Option A would be to require a public meeting prior to an applicant filing a land use application to the city for supportive housing in single-family zones. Or option B would be to maintain the current code and our current practice. And our practice is to encourage public outreach prior to the public application, or filing an application. But the code does not require public outreach to neighbors prior to filing the application. Public notice is provided prior to any public hearing to property owners within 500 feet and the signs are posted on the property and notices provided in the Herald. And that would be the current practice. So the benefit to earlier outreach would obviously be that the public would know earlier in the process, before an application is made, of what the proponent is suggesting or likely to apply for. And during that process, the applicant could get feedback from neighbors about issues that should be incorporated into the design of any application. We have only one process in the entire code where we do require a meeting with the neighbors prior to the filing of an application, and that is with an institutional overlay zone. So for example, Everett Community College or Providence Medical Center are located in institutional zones. For the expansions that each of them went through about 11 years ago, they did have to have public meetings before they made application. That's the only type of development application within our code where we actually require that meeting prior to application. Off-street parking standards. Option A would be to keep the current standard of 1 parking space per 4 bedrooms or 4 units, plus 1 for every 2 employees on the shift. Or option B would be to require a parking study to establish the amount of off-street parking based on the type of population being served and the staffing needed. And so that's not uncommon. Option B, we do have a number of land uses within our code where that is how we determine what the parking should be rather than having a prescribed parking standard. The fifth option is, or the fifth item is the need for sidewalks and for pedestrian safety. Option A would be to keep the current code, which allows the city to condition a project to require sidewalks if they're necessary. In many parts of the city they are. Or the application could be denied if the existing sidewalk network is just inadequate in order to provide public safety and safety for the residents of the supportive housing to get to transit or to get to wherever they may need to walk. Option B would be to require a pedestrian safety analysis by a qualified professional identifying the type and level of pedestrian improvements needed to serve the project residents and the neighborhood. And so in either case, whether we stayed with the current option A or require the type of analysis stated in option B, in an area that is has a well-established pedestrian sidewalk system, it probably wouldn't be necessary to require option B. But if we were in an area without adequate sidewalks, under either case, the analysis would probably be performed either by our own traffic engineering department in the case of if we stayed with option A, or under option B we may require just under the application process for the applicant to hire their own consultant to prepare that analysis. So there's not a lot of difference in one case. One way or the other, we'll get that information as part of either an application or through the review process. Again, if there's not an adequate sidewalk network, or that it's not reasonable financially for an applicant to construct the necessary improvements to make it safe, then their project would not be economically viable, or it could be denied by the hearing examiner under the current code, or if review process was changed, whoever is in charge of that review process. So at any rate, pedestrian safety is definitely part of the current review process, and it could be I guess strengthened if you had a more definitive requirement for that kind of analysis with the application. Item 6, access in proximity to transit and frequency of transit service. And this is, I believe, what Mr. Harris alluded to earlier this evening. Option A would be to keep at 500 feet for all zones in which supportive housing is allowed. That would mean that you could not have a supportive housing project that was located more than 500 feet from transit service, transit stop. Option B would to be expand that to 1/4 mile walking distance for all zones in which supportive housing is allowed. Option C would be to expand to 1/4 mile walking distance only in multifamily and commercial zones. And option D would be to remove the requirement for proximity to transit in commercial zones where services can also be located. So for example, whether that's counseling services, social services, or just general commercial services that would be needed by residents of supportive housing. Those can be provided in commercial zones without any special zoning dispensation. So if the Planning Commission or Council decide to maintain the current code and allow consideration of supportive housing in single-family zones only on publicly owned sites, expanding the distance to transit stops, as is identified in option B, is not likely to increase the number of eligible sites for supportive housing based on the description that I provided you a little while ago. If the city were to prefer to encourage supportive housing in multifamily and commercial zones, option C and option D would make more sites potentially available for supportive housing. Building height and density. So two options here. One would be to keep the current code, which allows the hearing examiner to review and determine allowable height and the number of rooms or units based on the compatibility criteria that are contained in our zoning code for special property use hearing examiner review process. Option B would be to limit building height to that which is allowed in the zone in which a property is located and require the building form to be similar in character to the types of housing that are allowed in that zone. So for example, in single-family zones, that would include single-family detached homes. In some zones, duplexes. In other single-family zones, townhouse building forms. So option A would allow supportive housing in single-family zone areas only on publicly owned property again, and the hearing examiner would have to determine if the proposed building height and density met the code criteria for compatibility. Option B would be more restrictive in single-family zoned areas and limit building height and forms to that which is allowed in the single-family zones. The eighth item, proximity to social services. Option A would maintain current or amended code provisions for access to transit, depending upon what you or the City Council may decide with regard to this requirement for proximity to transit. And in option A, you would not require the housing to be located close to social service providers. Option B would be to define the type of services that must be provided on-site based upon the needs of the residents. Option C would require supportive housing to be located near social services that are likely to be needed by the residents. So the current definition of supportive housing does require some services to be provided on-site, but not necessarily all services that a resident may need. Option A would allow for residents to access services located off-site, either by vehicular travel or by transit, if the residents are physically capable of getting from their housing to available transit service. And remember, some supportive housing may be for disabled residents who may be unable to even walk to the bus stop. The distance between housing and transit service under item 6, which ranges from either the 500 feet, the current maximum distance, to 1/4 mile walking distance, under option B would require the applicant to identify and the hearing examiner to require specific types of services that are needed by the residents of a particular project to be provided on site. Neither option A or B anticipate that all services needed by residents would be provided on site. Under option C, The applicant would have to identify, excuse me, the types of services that are needed by residents and to find a location that is close enough to such services for the convenience of those residents. And if you were to choose option C, a specified distance will have to be identified in the code. We haven't identified one as an option for you, but that would be something to talk about tonight if you choose. So the project review process, whether that should be hearing examiner or city council, option A would be to leave the hearing examiner as the review authority. Option B would be to require city council review for supportive housing in single-family zones. The staff comment there is just that about 40 years ago, 39 years ago, I'll say, the city council decided to get out of the land use review business and establish the hearing examiner review system for a number of reasons. One is that to take the politics out of the land use process and to put it in the hands of a hired expert, usually an attorney, and it's always been an attorney for the city of Everett. We've only had 2 hearing examiners in that 39-year period who are experts in land use law and process. That trend has been used in a lot of jurisdictions to increase objectivity on the part of the decision makers and to reduce municipal liability in contentious land use processes. Definition of supportive housing is item 10, and we've got the current definition there. I won't read it to you. We're not proposing any changes at this time. We may have some recommended changes for your next hearing on October 15th, based upon what we hear from you tonight and from the public. Number 11, open space, green space. And it wasn't, I don't think the council discerned a great distinction between the requirement for on-site open space versus the loss of open space in the particular case of the Norton ball field, which brought this matter to the council's attention, the loss of community open space to development. And the reason that I have not addressed that here is that really that situation applies to any public property that may be surplus for whatever the land use is. That's something that should be addressed either as if the city wants to establish some open space requirements or retention or acquisition policies, then that should be addressed there and not in the code for supportive housing. So I chose to give you 2 options for really addressing on-site open space or green space within a supportive housing project. The other larger issue is not something that really is something can be addressed in the supportive housing code here. So option A would be to require on-site open space on a case-by-case basis based upon the needs of residents determined through the applicable review process. Or option B would be to use a prescriptive approach similar to our multifamily standards, which in some cases require in some zones 100 square feet of on-site usable open space per dwelling unit. In some zones it's higher, but that would be an example of a prescriptive standard. Staff comment on that is that outdoor open space for some resident populations in supportive housing may not be as valuable as indoor activity spaces. Prescriptive standard, as stated in option B, may not be as responsive to the needs of residents as option A, which has a case-by-case evaluation of the needs of those residents. Enforcement of conditions, that was something that the City Council asked us to look at based on comments from the public saying, gee, can the city actually enforce conditions that it applies on the approval of a land use? And the answer is yes. There really is no response necessary to this. The city does have the legal authority to enforce any of our land use codes and any conditions of approval that are applied through the land use permit process. Item 13, impacts to the neighborhood. And we've identified 3 options there. One would be option A would be use the current regulation, which allows public comment on a particular land use application using the evaluation criteria of the zoning code, which also allows the review authority to establish conditions of approval to promote compatibility with surrounding land uses. Option B would be do not allow supportive housing in single-family zones. And option C would be to establish more detailed criteria or standards that can be used for any supportive housing project in any single-family zoned area. Compatibility would be determined through the permit review process by the review authority, and whether that's hearing examiner or city council. So that would be a lot like the current process, only we would try to identify additional criteria that address compatibility. And staff comment on that one is obviously option B would eliminate the potential for supportive housing in single-family zones. Option A already allows for public input and conditioning of projects to promote compatibility. Option C would be similar to A, but with additional criteria. If you were to identify perhaps other criteria that may not already be covered by Municipal Code Section 1941-150C, which in my experience are pretty thorough. So one thing, and I'm going to go over to page 7 of the packet. These are the existing regulations for supportive housing. The City Council did not ask you to review those, but if you were to make certain recommendations, we would have to identify what changes would be required to this particular section. What I have identified in this packet here is potential changes would be dependent upon whether or not the decision was made not to allow supportive housing in single-family zones. And if it, and there's not really significant substantive changes there, the only one that would be more substantive is in the middle of page item 2. Right now, access to transit must be available within 500 feet, and as we've talked, that might change if you wanted to expand it to something greater than that. Then this would be that section that would have to be amended. So those are the only changes that we've identified there. And I think that is all that I have with regard to those options, unless you have questions for me.
Does anyone have questions? Commissioner Yanosek?
I had a question on, we talked about option, or point number 6, the access to transit. There are option C and option D. I noticed option C talks about expanding the walking distance in multifamily and commercial zones, but option D only refers to commercial zones. Is there a reason why multifamily zones was left out of that, or was that just a?
That was just a nuance that I put in there for remove the proximity requirement for proximity to transit in commercial zones, and that's because you can have services of all types already in commercial zones. That would perhaps allow the services to be located near the housing rather than putting the housing in proximity to either services or transit to access those services. Just yeah, you could just as easily have left multifamily in that option D.
Okay, thank you. That's what I thought.
Any other questions?
I did have a question about the site on Grand Avenue that's currently used as a park. I noticed earlier in the document it said parks were omitted from the selection criteria, but is this park different in a way that made it qualify?
Yes, it's not a public city park. It's a school district property. If the school district, it's not a city owned or maintained. Well, I don't know who maintains that, to be honest with you. City. Okay, so it's not a city-owned park, and so if it were to be surplused, then you know, we didn't identify it as a park because it's not owned by the city.
Okay.
Yeah, one question, two questions, I guess. On 11, so there's no current approach for open space within supported housing developments?
There is no required minimum amount of open space. One of the things that we look at in the application process is what are the needs of the residents of the supportive housing, and it's part of what is included in a management plan. What are the needs? Will the people who live there need some type of outdoor recreation or open space, or are they going to be better served by having perhaps more indoor activity space? But in one way or the other, that is looked at. It's just not a prescriptive standard like we have for multifamily housing.
And I just have a procedure question. So are we going to listen to comments and then we're going to make recommendations for what we want to see on October 15th?
That is my recommendation to the commission, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I guess I do have one other question. I think this probably relates to last meeting and it still hasn't quite sunk in with me yet. With regard to meeting the definition of supportive housing, if someone wanted to do a project in a currently zoned commercial multifamily zone, what would be the benefit to them wanting to build that to meet the definition of supportive housing as opposed to just doing a multifamily that could still do all these things, but just wouldn't fall under that definition per se?
The real benefit is that the parking standard would be lower if it's a supportive housing project than it would be for a multifamily housing development. And that, can be significant in terms of the cost.
Anyone else? So at this time, we're going to open it up to public comment, and I have had quite a few folks sign up, so I'm just going to call people's names, and if you'd step to the podium and please state your name and your address before you get started, that would be terrific. The first person is James Ivory.
Go ahead.
There we go.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you. I'd like to say a couple of things. Number one, I wish that in the comments that the proposal that you had talked about the number of supportive housing that one residential neighborhood could support. Because we have two, this could be a third, and with what you gave us in the packet, we could potentially have a fourth. But there is nothing that you have presented tonight that would prevent Housing Hope from putting a fourth transitional housing unit within 5 blocks of each other and completely inundate a neighborhood. So I think that it would be feasible, or would be a good idea for you to look at a neighborhood and look at any neighborhood and say, how many transitional housing units can that neighborhood feasibly support and still remain a neighborhood? I also think that it is very reasonable to require that people who want to build transitional housing in a neighborhood first get public input. There would be a lot less stress, anger, resentment if people talk first rather than act first. Because when you act first, you really don't get the full picture of how people feel. And you run over their feelings. And it's very hard to get those feelings back. And the last thing I want to say is it's about your packet and what's at the end of it. I have an issue with it. Number one, it's from Canada. It isn't apples to apples and oranges to oranges. Secondly, we don't know what type of neighborhoods they are. Our neighborhood is a middle-class neighborhood. Some of the neighborhoods are middle-class neighborhoods. We don't know if this is a middle-class neighborhood or not. And number three, What we don't know is whether or not they renovated those buildings or whether or not they built those buildings. Because if you renovate the buildings, the property value goes up because who wants to have buildings filled with rats and drugs and, all that other stuff? The property values will automatically go up when those buildings are renovated. So let's compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. Find an example of where you've taken an open space, build on it in a middle-class neighborhood, and then and the study has been done to show how that affected the property values in the United States, not Canada. And that's all I have to say.
Bob Jackson, could you please step to the podium?
Bob Jackson, 717 33rd Street. I think the one thing I would like to see you remember as you plan any changes to the rules is that the reason we're here discussing this is that there are so many people who do not have a roof over their head. So that's the real issue that has to be addressed. I don't think, as the previous speaker said, anybody can make an argument that it's not good to inform people before you start a project, whether it's required or strongly urged. That's up to you. But I would urge you to be extremely flexible in all the changes that you consider, the amount of space that's open space within a project, the type of housing that's going to go in. Supportive housing has different needs. People that are families that have children, I think are perfectly appropriate in a single-family housing zone. The amount of space to the bus stop, all these things. If it's everybody there is handicapped, maybe that's less. If it's not a hard thing to walk a quarter of a mile if you're just a normal person. So all these things and the sidewalks, I just hope that you remain as flexible as you can so that the projects can come up one at a time because we really need more supportive housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Ms., and if I've mispronounced names, I do apologize. Young Bluff? Young Bluff. Sorry.
It's German, very German. Lindsay Junglu, 3532 Norton Avenue. I just wanted to quickly expand on what James was talking about with the BC housing case study that was attached to your packets. I dug in a little bit deeper on that, and I think there's a lot of press out that's just stating that supportive housing does nothing to the neighborhoods and housing values, and that's not really what studies are showing. So this one in particular says, many studies over the years illustrate that stereotypes about the impacts of social housing are often unfounded, and that appropriately designed and integrated social housing in a neighborhood can actually increase property values. But if we're using this case study as information that can be applied to Everett, then we need to carefully look at and examine the sites and references in the document so we can apply an equal comparison. So the key to this BC study is that they appropriately designed and integrated these buildings in areas of moderate to high density housing. And these buildings were not placed in a park or small historic neighborhood. They were placed next to other high to moderate density developments and amenities. A majority of these developments replaced existing buildings at a similar scale. That's why these projects did not negatively impact housing value. So if you read a lot of the comprehensive analyses regarding this issue, you will find that Some of the case studies actually have mixed or negative impacts for nonprofit developed affordable housing projects on home values. Some of these studies were based on suburban areas, suggesting that impacts of nonprofit affordable housing may differ based on the location within a central city or suburb. And regardless of the neighborhood context, affordable housing projects generate the most neighborhood property value benefits when replacing blighted conditions, such as abandoned buildings. So I just would like the commission to look at more studies, not just this study. And I've sent this to Alan and to David, so you guys can read it if you want. There's a couple articles that synthesize about 70 different pieces of information. So I know time is valuable, so thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth Koenig?
I know you guys are probably tired of me, and I'm tired of getting up here, but here I go. Okay, Elizabeth Koenig, 3516 Norton Avenue. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about 5 of the points that you detailed. Number 1 is allow in single-family zones. So the 4 properties you identified, 2 in Port Gardner and 2 in Madison, of those 4, 2 of them are less than 1.5 acres, and the third has buildings on it already. So I feel like most likely you're down to the 1 property. And you say there's little opportunity to site supportive housing in single-family zones. Therefore, I feel like this 1 property will be singled out and impacted if the ordinance remains. And I urge you to take option B to eliminate this ordinance. Number 3, public notice earlier in the process. The way the Berkshire project came about was not ideal. Neighborhoods there felt there was not enough notice or chance for input. And the current project planned on one of your 4 identified properties was handled with even more secrecy. The school district had been planning for months, if not years, to do this, and the notice to the community was virtually non-existent. 3 directly affected residents of the neighborhood learned about it the afternoon the lease was signed. None could attend the 4:30 p.m. school board meeting due to their work schedules. Almost all who spoke for the project were somehow connected with the business of housing. Please choose option A. Secrecy is very damaging to trust. It is unlikely any sort of good relationship between the 2 entities and the neighbors will ever be restored, in my opinion. I'm just shaking when I say this because it's still very upsetting. Okay, number 4, off-street parking standards. I keep wondering why it is fair to limit vehicles for people who are trying to get back on their feet and get to their workplace. Our transit system is not ready for this. It is too difficult to get to certain areas, and to require people to leave home and their children extra early, walk long distances from a bus stop in the rain is discriminatory. Option B is the only fair option. Number 9, project review process, hearing examiner, or city council. Your recommendation seems to be that the hearing examiner is the only option. At the July 10th council meeting, 2 Everett City Council members with many years of experience stated that the public comment portion of the hearing examiner process is at the end and comments are unlikely to have an effect on the hearing examiner's decision, as they are really only looking at how the project follows the rules. After hearing that, you can bet the residents concerned with a major change to their neighborhood were alarmed to realize that their voices and opinions have little power to make any difference. Please consider option B. 13, impacts to neighborhood. A few of the many impacts to neighborhoods are, first, increased density. Everyone who bought houses in single-family neighborhoods did so intentionally. We chose not to live in a high-density area. 2 of your identified Port Gardner sites are in a historic overlay. I don't understand why it is acceptable to go in and completely change a neighborhood just because a developer wants to do so. A 50-unit apartment building of any kind and 150 more residents will change the character of historic neighborhoods forever. The city needs to focus on increasing density where it belongs. Also, eventual loss of historic homes from increased density resulting from opening the door to more zoning changes. No, not because of supportive housing. People move out Because the neighborhood becomes too dense, homes become rentals, then are sold to developers and torn down to make way for oversized apartment buildings. Just look at Fremont and Ballard to see this. Maintain and preserve Everett's history in our historic neighborhoods. Choose option B.
Ms. Koenig?
Lastly, what?
Oh, you're
I have
you're
one
wrapping
little
up.
paragraph.
One more.
Lastly, I would like to say that I really don't agree with the way your options were written. Do not allow supportive housing in single-family zones is not accurate. It should be, do not allow mid and high-density buildings in single-family zones. Contrary to what you seem to think, I am personally not against supportive housing in my neighborhood at all, but the size and the density of that housing.
Thank you. Ted Mosharif?
I'm Ted Mossard. I live on 111, wait, that's 3 ones, 1112 Clinton Place. I don't know where to start. The impact is, this is very, very, very stressful on our neighborhood. Open space, I'll just bullet forms here. I worked at Echo Glen Children's Center, and I used to go travel to Fall City. And Issaquah on the hill used to be a green space, an open space. It was spectacular. Now there's houses. My wife and I bought our house in large part because of the space on Norton. It's beautiful, it's open, it's pleasing, it's aesthetic. I can't say enough about how important it is to me. We've identified, in terms of impact, noise, the police that come to the supportive housing place on 35th and Norton. Last month I was here, I was telling you I was a mental health counselor. I specialize working in trauma with homeless teens. I work with, I have clients who are involved, are staying at group homes in Pioneer Human Service. It's the social service agency. And they have 3 different group homes. I have clients that are in the reservation in Marysville, and there's a group home in Linwood right next to the Whole Foods. That's a single family neighborhood. The crime rates are impacted by my clients. Homeless teens deal with trauma, and with trauma, their executive functioning is compromised. And last time I was here, I was talking about fight or flight mode. And what's going to happen in our neighborhood is if this project gets approved, some of the clients are going to be hopping the fence and going into our neighborhood, and crime will go up. It just does. On the reservation, when my clients get mad, they walk for 2 or 3 hours, come back, nothing happens. But in Linwood, when they get mad, I have 2 clients now at Denny Youth Center who are serving time because they left the group home, they were pissed off, they vandalized a garage, stole something, the police get called, and they're in trouble. In this neighborhood, their crime will go up because of this, because you're dealing with people who are impermanent, who have dealt with trauma. And I know it's kind of taboo to talk about crime with poor people, but these are my people. I work for them, fight for them. I've been in the trenches for 25 years, and if we don't talk about it, I'm not doing a service to the city or my neighborhood. I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave Ramstad?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Dave Ramstad, 1301 Pinkerton Avenue in South Everett, Beverly Park. I'm also a member of the Everett Historical Commission. Some of the land for supportive housing in question, which we're discussing tonight, is in the Norton Grand Historical Overlay. We've heard that several times from other participants here. That historical overlay was built with a lot of work of the residents there and submitted to the city, approved by the planning department and the city council long ago. Everett has 3 historical overlays, But beyond that, Everett is a historical city in general. Not only do we have homes out in the north, 120 years old, we have homes at Claremont that are 50 years old. The 50-year-old years is the federal status for going historic. So generally, I think we have a city that's half, three-quarters, if not more, historic in status. So historical overlay or just a generally vintage neighborhood, my request is that the Everett Historical Commission be a part of these discussions in terms of the style and design and massing of any particular project that's going near it or in a historic neighborhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fred Safstrom?
Fred Sastrom, 717 Grand Avenue. I want to I guess, rather than make comments on particular items that recommendations have been made by staff, I want to just remind us of the perspective, why this ordinance was put in place. We have a severe housing crisis in this community. And this crisis is particularly acute for those that are most in need. Supportive housing is serving those residents. The persons that would be housed in supportive housing lack housing, period. So when we take actions that eliminate the opportunity to create a supportive housing project reasonably within a single-family neighborhood, yes, within a single-family neighborhood, we are saying that these citizens are better or should, under our rules, remain homeless. To say that we can just choose another property. Here we have in single-family zones, we are only talking about publicly owned land. We're not talking about an ordinance that would take supportive housing and putting it into any single-family zone. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a very limited opportunity where a public agency has determined that supportive housing would be in the public interest for that property. I would encourage us to take advantage of those opportunities. They are rare and they are extremely valuable. And it's my hope that, that we would take action that would improve the ordinance that exists, which I think is a good ordinance. But to keep in mind what the objective is and who we're trying to serve.
Thank you. Andrea Tucklin? Tucker? Tucker, no, I can't read right.
Hi there, Andrea Tucker, 3330 Wetmore Avenue. Because we can't speak specifically to a project, originally I was going to talk about the ordinance when it was crafted in 2016. It didn't address historic overlays. I didn't see where it addressed historic overlays at all. And I think that we have to pay attention to historic overlays, and an example of that is this last weekend. We had a historic home tour. Historic Everett had a historic home tour. We had 300 people attend the historic home tour. Our historic neighborhoods are important to the city and to economic development. 300 people paid $20 to look at 6 houses in our neighborhood. historic neighborhoods are beneficial to economic development as well as the character of neighborhoods. Every neighborhood doesn't have to be combined with mixed use and, it'd be a really boring city if everything is just combined and looks the same. So I just want to speak to the ordinance that was specific to one population and look at it from a different view from each population and decide whether or not it's appropriate for the neighborhood or the place that was, any of the places that were identified. Thank you.
Thank you. Caroline Mason?
Good evening. My name's Caroline Mason. I live at 1020 North Park Drive. I am a former resident of 34th Avenue and 33rd and Federal in the neighborhood. I am also a current school board director, and I just want to clarify that I'm not here representing the school board this evening. I'm not speaking on behalf of the district or the school board. And I just wanted to make a couple points because I think that maybe not all the facts come out in moments like this. It becomes a very emotional kind of process. First, I would like to address number 3, public notice. I believe that option A is probably the better choice. I think that more public notice needs to be given for projects like this, and we need to spend time informing neighborhoods prior to any action taken. So that would be my recommendation there. I also want to highlight something that no one has addressed. These are surplus properties of public entities. The school district currently has no plans, and it is on their documents that this property has no future use. We do extensive analysis on growth in all of our neighborhoods and at all of our schools. The analysis is incredibly accurate, and at this point in time, for the next several decades, there is no use that the school district will need this particular piece of property. In the years since it has not been used for school use, the district has paid for the maintenance of this property at taxpayer dollars. So one neighborhood has benefited from the use of that particular parcel. I would also like to encourage you to look at, and I don't know how this plays into the process, but look at the surrounding properties. Many of these properties that I looked at on the map tonight and for the first time became aware of is they're surrounded by R3 and R4. So for example, on the Norton property, there's a new, I don't know if it's 3-story home.
Please do not interrupt someone speaking.
Okay, so I won't address specific pieces of property. I will just say that I encourage you to look at the surrounding properties and the use on the different borders of that particular property, whether they're actually contained within an R1 use or they border that with other uses such as R3 and R4. And I think that's all I have, so thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to the podium? I think I've gone through the stack of folks who have signed up. Please.
My name is Cynthia Wheaton, and I live in the Riverside neighborhood. And I'm speaking from the perspective of a person who has lived in this community for over 40 years, and most of that time I was poor. And during the time that I was raising my son as a single mom, I lived in both the Northwest neighborhood and the Bayside neighborhood, and I was able to do that working almost minimum wage job because there were enough single family and small duplex, quadruplex properties that were available at a reasonable rate. That's not true anymore. The neighborhoods in our North End who have traditionally housed our our unemployed, our minimally employed, our divorced moms have lost capacity, and now some of our residents who've lived here for generations are no longer able to afford to live in Everett. So that aside, I just want to point out that when we're talking about historic overlay, poor people have always been part of the history of Everett. And so we can't just sweep them under the rug because we don't like our neighborhoods to look like poor people are part of our community. But that's not actually what I came up here to talk about. I just have a long history of relying on public transit for my transportation needs, and it is not at all uncommon to have to walk 3 or 4 blocks to get to the closest bus stop. So I think you should really take a look at that. Item 6, access proximity to transit, and think seriously about option B. And when I think about that quarter-mile walking distance being applied to supportive housing, I'd just like to point out something that has not been mentioned here at all. And that's that anyone who's old enough or disabled enough that 500 feet or a quarter of a mile would be prohibitive to them, those people have access to paratransit. And paratransit will come and pick them up at their door and deliver them to whatever services or grocery store or whatever church, whatever they need to attend at the same rate as our city buses. So then my other question regarding the bus is, think about this, and I'd like to know at some point, in the Riverside, in the Delta neighborhood, recently a supportive housing complex was proposed, the Riverview 2 project, and my understanding is that it was denied and is no longer planned to be supportive housing, only low-income housing, because it was not within 500 feet of the closest bus stop. So did anybody consider asking Everett Transit to jog the route by a block? I just want to point out that there are other options besides disallowing a project because of transit proximity. We have other agencies in town that we can work with to facilitate the needs of our low income and supportive needs people. So thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to come to the podium? Mr. Harris?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Victor Harris, 3017 Lombard in beautiful downtown Everett. It would seem you might be a little surprised. I'm not disabled enough. I don't get paratransit. Believe that. Believe my dog's sitting beside me here. Yeah, I didn't realize there was a checkbox that you had to have 7 yeses against 3 noes or some such. But more important, there's a question that's been floating around in my mind tonight, a little bit about my own living situation, which is independent living and supportive housing. And there's a distinction there that needs to be clarified, and that line may be very gray. It may be a very broad line as to who falls where. When we go back into supportive housing and we talk about taking people off the streets and getting them on the path to a better life, again, it was mentioned earlier about taking people out of their cars, taking their cars away from them because there's not enough parking on site. That still rankles me. I think our parking numbers are too low. in my case with supportive housing, with a number of neighbors with supportive, not supportive, independent living, we have enough people coming in helping us on a daily basis that the parking that we have is overutilized. There's a big parking fight because there's not enough parking spaces. So I think that's something to consider along with the definition and the clarification of supportive and independent living situation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, so at this time, this is just a public workshop. Where's commission at on this issue? Any thoughts?
I have a question, maybe Alan could, well, I'm looking at number 7, the options presented A and B. And I'm wondering, is there really a distinction between those? I guess maybe I'm not familiar enough with the criteria in 1941 150C, but to say that we keep the current code to allow the hearing examiner to review and determine allowable heights based on compatibility criteria, or that you limit building heights to the zone which is located, and say that it has to meet the character and type of housing allowed for the zone. But isn't that something that the hearing examiner would necessarily consider anyway? And potentially would they get you to the same place?
Not necessarily. And I'll give you the example of the Claire's Place supportive housing project on Berkshire. That's was built on an R1 zone property. It was the first project built in the single-family zone, supportive housing project built in the single-family zone since the code was, amended. And in that case, I don't remember the number of stories, if it's 4 or 5, but it's taller than is allowed for single-family development in the single-family zone. And that was using the criteria for the hearing examiner to review for compatibility. In the case of this one, it was located, further away than right across the fence line from single-family homes, and so the criteria allowed for that to be a taller building and, with a different building form than is typically found in single-family zones.
But I guess because it is so site-specific, would the hearing examiner be required to consider those things? Like, if in any particular property, if it was completely surrounded by, say, 25-foot single-family residences, that would be something that the hearing examiner would have to consider.
Yes.
In making a determination, as opposed to saying, well, all of a sudden I'm going to allow a 60-foot, 150-unit, box building.
Right. A lot of the things that go into the consideration would be the size of the property, the distance between the proposed building and other structures and houses nearby, buffering between them, landscaping, the amount of open space that you can provide on the site. And so it's not like just shoehorned in between existing single-family homes surrounding it.
And density is something that is considered by the, in the compatibility criteria?
Yes.
Any other questions or thoughts?
Would you like to go through item by item, 1, 2, 3, 4, and
Sure. I actually, so we can start off, and actually that's a good way of doing it, because I think item number 1 kind of gets to the heart of it.
I think so.
Yeah, so we'll start off with item number 1. Commissioner comments, thoughts,
Well,
recommendations?
I believe the recommendation was from staff is to table number 1 until the next meeting, but to discuss the other items, so.
Agreed.
Agreed.
So we will table number 1. So many of the other options are kind of contingent on table, option number 1. But we will go on to option number 2. What's commission's thought on option number 2?
I guess I'd just say, I agree that, number one, I mean, the council's asked us to look at the issue. If we just say jump to option B, then we haven't done what the council has asked us to do. So we have to have some discussion on this. I would just say with regard to option 2, or number 2, my thought is that maintain the current code requirement, I think does allow for the flexibility to respond to, any particular site that may be proposed. So I think I'd be leaning toward option A in that.
I would agree with Commissioner Yanisette.
I would also agree. I think in terms of remaining flexible where possible, this is an easy one.
I would agree with option A. However, back to question 1, it is binary, and given that much of this discussion is not necessary if one of the options is chosen in question 1, it does seem as though we should at least have some discussion on option 1 and frame the topic, because I think there's been a lot of discussion here tonight and in the last meeting amongst the commissioners as well as the public that confused the question of whether or not we should be allowing supportive housing in single-family zones as opposed to the importance and the need for supportive housing in general. And I think it's very important to make that distinction, because I wouldn't want to cloud one decision-making process with an overwhelmingly important topic.
Any comments to Commissioner Finch's point?
I would agree, but we're the commission and we haven't heard the whole story yet. And to, where I'm coming from is to make or start to focus and hone in on a specific, I think it's too early. I don't think enough, we haven't heard from the public. It's, as commissioners, our job is to listen to the public and filter it through what we know and we understand and we've heard from others. So that's why I supported what the recommendation was, is to hold off.
I agree, and I do think that working through some of these issues provides some additional information that helps you get to a decision on topic number 1. I guess for me, I keep coming back to this is a question about providing for supportive housing in single-family residential zones, of which we have 2, as I understand it, in Everett, correct? The R1 and the R2. The R3 provides for multifamily.
There's also R1A and R2A, which allow for townhouses, but they're considered single-family zones.
Great. And so we have a limited number of single-family zones in Everett. We have a smaller number of historic overlays in Everett, and staff has identified 4 properties that potentially fit the requirements for supportive housing in single-family zones on property owned by municipalities. One of those 4 properties currently has 22 units on it, so it's effectively at capacity from a zoning standpoint, as I understand it. One of them is somewhat compromised because it's divided by a roadway, and the other 2 are in the Norton Grant Historic Overlay. And so I think putting the properties that are applicable in context does have some merit to this conversation.
Maybe we could frame it in such a way that when we have a better understanding of where we fall on these subsequent issues, then maybe we can, I understand where you're coming from. I also want to start from 1 and then go, but I think, if we can piece through our opinions on the other things, then maybe it will make it easier.
I'm not trying to shut down discussion whatsoever. I want to make sure that we all understand the playing field here, because the way I look at it, there's almost 20 acres of property that could possibly be made available that is not single-family residential property, as opposed to the under 8 acres that are currently zoned with a significantly lower density. And so I want to make sure that as we go through items 2 and beyond, that we kind of keep those facts in our mind.
So I'd actually like to add a comment here on this particular option number 1. I think that single family as a zone is so unique, and infrastructure, all sorts of other considerations, that I don't think it should be permitted through a conditional use. But I think that it is, particularly in this city, because there's so few properties, that it is something that should have more scrutiny and a more significant public review process. I understand that staff would like us to recommend to actually not discuss this particular option until a later time, but I actually, go ahead.
You can talk about whatever you want.
But the reality is that single family in particular in a really well-established neighborhood is a pretty unique place, and it has infrastructure that's been put in place over a period of time. And I think that does deserve, and I completely recognize the urgency of the particular situation that we're dealing with in terms of supported housing. Commissioner Lauber?
Oh, I was just going to say, it's procedural. This isn't a hearing. We haven't had an advertised hearing, so we're supposed to have a hearing in a month. And so it seems to preclude having a hearing if we made a decision about that today. Is that the thought of staff?
Staff's recommendation was for you to defer making a decision, of course, but, if you had a preference on some of these other things where, it wasn't pivotal on whether or not you were going to allow that, the other ones really related more to either standards or process. And so, your decision, good point about doing that in an advertised public hearing. You're not going to be making a decision tonight on anything. What we've asked for is for you to defer making a decision on that until you have the advertised public hearing. Discuss whatever you want, but as far as the standards go, if you have an inclination of the process, inclination of what you like to support, we can draft something a little bit more precisely for your next hearing.
And that's exactly the point, is that staff, the next meeting will be the public hearing, and it will have a draft resolution. And so my inclination is to actually have that draft resolution recommend to City Council that we take single family out of the conditional use review process. That's my thoughts on option number one. Anyone care to comment?
I guess I'd just say I appreciate both those comments, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I guess just kind of as a procedural and working through this, the way I kind of view it is knowing that allowing this type of thing in single family is, I think, kind of a big deal. My thinking is, well, understanding that, if that was going to be something, what could we do? What are the options for putting restrictions or regulating that? Let's kind of get that all on the table. What would that look like? And then kind of say, now, given that that's what it would look like, is this something that we still feel should be allowed in a single family zone? Or given all these other issues that play into this that would need to be considered, it's just not feasible or appropriate? Given any limitations on restrictions that we could place on it and that sort of thing. So maybe looking at it in a reverse way. It's kind of my thought of it.
So I think the point that's really important to understand is you're not eliminating single family, because there is the option of going through a rezone application process, which does require a decision by City Council. It also requires much more public input. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, is there is recourse. It's much more challenging, but in my mind, because we are talking about the character of a single-family established residential neighborhoods, and the fact that infrastructure and everything else has been built around anticipating that particular use, I think it's worthy of going through a more rigorous process. So that's my point. So you're not eliminating, you're just making it more challenging. Conditional use is a more expeditious review process. And you take the expertise of the hearing examiner, and they can actually condition the review process accordingly. So I get that supportive housing is desperate and urgent in this community, but the baggage that comes with what has happened historically with Claire's Place and the projects that have been permitted through this process, it's not worth, in my mind, the goodwill we lose with the public in terms of giving them the opportunity to have comment on what happens.
Chairman, yeah, just a question for Alan. Do you know how many existing supportive housing that meets the definition of supportive housing, whether it was approved through this ordinance or through a previous ordinance, are located in single-family zones? Do you have that, or is that information you could bring back to the hearing for us?
Well, if it's located in a single-family zone, it would just be the Claire's Place application. There are probably supportive housing developments that we don't know about because they were permitted as multifamily housing development. And, you know, that's how we've regulated it prior to 2016. If it was multifamily housing in a multifamily zone, it could have services for the residents, and we didn't call it supportive housing. And so there may be, you know, we don't know how many. It was built as multifamily housing. In single-family zones, there would be just the one.
And the reason for my questioning is if, depending on what the commission recommends, is how many facilities would become non-conforming. So that was the reason for my questioning, so. And just to, I guess, to add to that, it appears that, you know, reviewing the ordinance and changes to the proposed ordinance, regardless of number 1, which I agree is the hot topic, is 1 and 13 appear to be the two that are directly related to one another, whether or not allowing such a use in a single-family zone. So, but I think all these other topics are, you know, dancing around the issues that the council wanted us to review in relationship to the existing ordinance. And so I think it is pertinent to, regardless of what our feelings are in the single-family zone, to go through those and see what the commission, the sense of feel for each one of these other issues, because it affects it regardless, whether it's allowed in a single family, not allowed in a single family, and so on. So I think it would be appropriate to do that, regardless of what use is allowed, and if it's allowed in single family or not.
Agreed.
I agree.
Okay, so we are on number 2, types of supportive housing and management models, and what I heard was that Planning Commission seems like there's a majority that supports option A, which would be the lesser prescriptive, have a plan put in place that's specific to a particular project. Is that?
I suppose the way I would say is that if we were going to recommend that we continue to allow the ordinance to authorize, or to allow under this ordinance, the supportive housing in a single-family zone, that my preference would be for A, but that's the if, which we haven't gotten to yet.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying one way or another what that decision ultimately would be.
So a point of clarification, I'll get right to you, is if it is not single-family, if it is all other eligible zones like multifamily, would option B be your preference? Is that what you're saying?
I suppose not even in that case. I suppose, I believe under for supportive housing, as my position would be that maintaining that kind of flexibility in there would be preferable, whether single-family or not.
Commissioner
That's all I was going to say, is that it
Good
could
point.
apply to other zones, so we still have to discuss it. It's in the ordinance, you know,
Right.
so I'm just saying, yeah. What he just said, I mean, we have to consider it for other zones besides whether you even allow it in single families.
Right.
So let's move on.
Because actually, point 2 doesn't actually, it's a more general for the, it doesn't even apply to
Okay,
this
so
section.
in terms of recommending what staff needs to go forward, are we supporting option A, is what I'm understanding?
Do you want to go down the line, or should we?
We can go down the line. We'll start with Commissioner Finch.
I support option A.
I support option A.
Option A.
Likewise.
Commissioner Tisdall?
It depends, okay, yeah, I'm all right. I've got concerns at a lot of other places, but I'll go there.
Yeah, as stated previously on the record, I supported Commissioner Yannisak's sentiment towards that, item 2.
And I would say, I'm fine with it, but, I mean, do we have to vote on each issue, or couldn't we just, if we don't have an opinion on a particular one, then we will go with what other people are saying? This
Just
is
say
sort
no
of
opinion.
an informal situation? I mean, do we have to vote?
I think it's just an informal, we're
It's
just.
an
Yeah, we're
informal-
discussing,
We're
so
just
if 3
talking.
people say something I agree to, do I have to say anything?
You don't,
you
you can
don't.
just say no
You don't.
comment.
Yeah,
Or not say anything?
yeah.
Okay.
No, I don't think we need to go through and ask each commissioner what they feel on them. If they have strong opinions on any particular number, in my opinion, then they should voice those opinions at this time.
Okay, so we're just going to discuss these, and we're going to kind of come to a consensus that this is the direction we're going. We're not going to make an opinion or not. Okay, so we're on to number 3, public notice earlier in the process.
Commissioner Ben? Personally, I feel that option A is a preferred option, and just with my background in land use and controversial projects, it always seems that it's better to get out in front of the issue and talk to the neighbors. And then that way they understand what the project is. There's a lot of misconceptions. I had one last week where, there's a lot of rumors floating around the neighborhood, and, most of them were not true. And by the time they left, they felt pretty positive about the project. So I think by doing that before an application is actually submitted, gets not only the citizens to understand what the project is and the people that might live there or whatever type of project it is, but also allows the developer to understand what the concerns are of the citizens and potentially adjust their application accordingly to maybe mitigate some of those concerns. So that's my opinion.
Any other thoughts?
I would just say that I think I would agree with Chris on this one, particularly if there's single family anywhere adjacent to the site. Even if it's in a commercial zone, but there's single family adjacent to it, I would say that's true. If there's no single family anywhere adjacent to the site, you might be able to get by without a requirement. But it's always a good idea to do it, and encouraging it would definitely be appropriate.
Alan, quick question. Do you have in the code where if you receive so many comments back on an application, or can the director determine that whether or not he thinks an application is controversial enough that you require during the pre-application process or whatever that they conduct a neighborhood meeting? Is that something that's already written into code, or is this something that should be clarified here?
The planning director does not have the authority to require somebody to have a neighborhood meeting. We strongly encourage it before any application is filed. When we have a pre-application discussion with any applicant, we always advise them to meet with neighbors to get input before they make application, but we don't have the authority to require it.
Thank you.
I would agree with what's been said, that option A seems like a reasonable, and I think the more communication that you have, especially in a single-family neighborhood, the better. The earlier, the better. The more, the better. I know that more meetings aren't always more helpful, but certainly making as many people aware as possible. It strikes me as a lot of the anxiety over this current process was just caused by too little information reaching too few people, a little too late.
Commissioner
Yeah,
Fitch?
I guess my only comment would be, as it specifically relates to single family, I think option A, the requirement, I think that's important. I think that it becomes less important as a requirement in higher density locations for a variety of reasons. But I guess so I'm saying, depending upon the binary nature of question 1, I think that my answer to this may change.
And I would agree, but I actually think that getting out even in a multifamily area would be probably preferable. The more education you can give, the more heads up, I think it's better for the public. So that's my thought on it.
Well, and I think it's good practice to establish that communication loop and get that feedback early on in the process, so it streamlines the project and potentially reduces cost, thereby reducing barriers. I would not want to make the requirement appear to be a barrier, however, to supportive housing in higher density areas. So I think that there's a developer skill set that should come along with understanding that getting out there early is important, but I'm sensitive to throwing up roadblocks to
Making
promoting-
it a requirement.
Yeah,
And that's a
yeah.
really good point. That's a really good point. Not a lot of direction. A lot of good thoughts.
I can work with it.
With something, you can work with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Always the professional.
I'm gonna make the suggestion that maybe we try to combine 4 and 5. Because I think that, you know, these are kind of transportation infrastructure issues that, depending on what we do here, that these could potentially be combined. Does anyone have thoughts on that?
I guess that my perspective is that these are two separate issues. While they
Agreed.
both are transportation in nature, the parking requirements are specific to the project, and I guess that the current standard I'm okay with as it relates to supportive housing in non-single-family neighborhoods. I think that relative to option B, I'm also open to that so long as there is a minimum established, because things change over time. And the character of those developments also may change over time. And so it's important, I think, to establish a floor for parking requirements so that should things change in the future, they don't negatively impact the neighborhood.
Commissioner Labra, did you have comments?
Yes, I think option B makes more sense. I agree that there should be a minimum, but different types of developments could have extremely different parking requirements. And that is on off-street parking, so that's within the development. And as far as the sidewalks, those are off the development on public right-of-way, so I think those are really different issues. So anyway, I would definitely support option B with a minimum of subtype for this parking. That's.
A question, I asked a little bit earlier, why someone who's already building in a multifamily zone would want to apply for a definition under supportive housing, and I guess my understanding is it was only because there would be some parking benefits. Would this just be eliminating that and essentially?
Not necessarily, no. If it's based upon the projected demand for parking, it could still be a lower parking requirement than a standard multifamily housing development. It probably would be, depending upon the nature of residents who will be living there.
Because I just know the way these options are written, they would seem to apply to support housing in either a single-family zone or a multifamily zone. And I'm just wondering, should those be considered differently? I would think probably yes. More restrictive, I would say, if it was in a single-family zone as opposed to maybe an area that's already commercial or multifamily.
I would say that was a really good point.
Commissioner Zelinski?
Well, the staff comments suggest that the city is used to requiring parking studies for a variety of different things. So that suggests that the staff is used to seeing these things, and the consulting community out there is probably used to preparing them, and so I think B makes the most sense for this kind of where each project might be unique, but it lends itself to B.
Commissioner Tisdale?
I would support A. I would get my comments would come, or my reason for my comments come from spending about 7 years with my mother before passing, and she was in 4 different facilities. I know they're a different kind of facility, but I think Victor hit it on the head. The family would go to visit, and we couldn't find any parking because there could be 5 or 6 DSHS people there for different people, and so it's the service providers that we don't know how many are going to show up. And she fell and hurt herself, so all of a sudden she's got 1 extra physical therapist person showing up, and And I'm just talking about, I know it's different, but we're still talking about a facility that's gonna have services come into it, and it's gonna have visitors, family members and that, so I would really support my problem with B is, I've even done some of it. You can hire a consultant to tell you whatever you want to tell you to make your project work. And I don't think that's correct. And I'm not saying that is going to be done. I'm not talking about this specific site. I'm just talking in general. I think it's a way to, they're professional, everything's done by the code. I'm not saying that they don't do that. But anyway, that's my comments as A.
Any other thoughts?
I guess I just say in response to that, if everybody can build with a 1 per 4 bedroom, that there could be situations where any particular project might need more parking, actually. And option B, I think, would actually allow for that better than option A to respond to the individual circumstances of any particular.
If it had some, I really like Michael's, I think is the best, where you get a minimum and then the study.
Okay. So I think we can move on to number 6.
Five.
5, excuse me. Need for sidewalks for pedestrian safety? Thoughts?
Commissioner May? I'm comfortable with the way the current code reads.
I would agree. I think it addresses, it has to have the right infrastructure there around it.
I concur.
I agree,
All right. So we'll move on to number 6, access, proximity to transit, and frequency of transit service.
I really agree with all the comments I've heard about needing more than 500 feet. I mean, that's such a short walk, and it eliminates sites. I just think at least a quarter mile would be reasonable for all zones. So that's my comment.
Commissioner Zelinski?
I would also support that, going to the 13, 20, or quarter mile. But I would go further, and I define that as a distance defined from the center of the site to the nearest transit stop along a safe pedestrian route, which kind of gets the safe pedestrian thing into the picture.
All right.
Yeah, I think that accurately captures my concern. I think that expanding to a quarter mile makes sense. However, I think it should be path of travel to a transit stop, not just a bus driving by
the
you
nearest point.
in a radius.
Right, yeah, to an actual.
Let's turn the building meter right there. We go.
All right, I think we're comfortable with number 6. Moving on to number 7, building height and density.
I would strongly advocate for option B if we are going to make each zone in which housing is permitted open to supportive housing. I think that the supportive housing should be respectful to the housing types already in place. I think if they are allowed in a zone in which they're required to be single-family homes, that they should also be single-family homes of the appropriate height and character.
Any other comments?
Yeah, my comment would be, I think it really depends on what the commission recommends related to uses and zones. Because I'm completely comfortable with A, if certain things happen, and if not, I'm comfortable with B.
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Holland. I guess in the context of discussing points 2 and beyond, I would advocate for option B.
Well, wouldn't there also be another maybe middle ground to allow a different standard if in a single-family zone as opposed to a non-single-family zone? I think that
Alan,
wasn't
you want to weigh in on
proposed
that
or.
question?
And you could certainly come up with another option that would be different, for, in single-family zones than you did not allow. The city council ended up changing it so that you didn't allow it at all in single-family zones. Then you would have, just the standards that apply in multifamily zones or commercial zones already in place. You wouldn't be, need to have any kind of special compatibility review like you do now under the single family with the criteria that's used by the hearing examiner.
I guess not to put words in your mouth, but what I thought I heard Chris saying there was that if option A apply would in maybe non-single family, but option B in single family, that kind of thing.
Correct.
And that might make sense to me too.
Does that work for you, Alan, in terms of kind of writing up a?
Right.
Okay. All right. If everyone's comfortable, we're going to move along to number 8, proximity to social services. Any comments here?
I've got a question. In looking at the options that are outlined, and specifically thinking about option B, define the type of services that must be provided on-site based on needs of residents. How are the needs of residents codified? Or is it a deed restriction? So those are perpetual needs associated with the property, or might those change over time?
They could change over time. And it's not a deed restriction, it's a condition of approval on a land use permit. And it could be revisited if the type of resident changes or something changes over time to where we need to readdress or revisit services.
Thank you.
Quick question. Alan, I'm having a hard time wrapping my brain around this one. So like option B, even if we did identify the services that are needed for the facility, what does that change about the actual supportive housing project? I mean, what would the hearing examiner do other than require that they provide those services?
Then, yeah, that would likely have to be addressed in the management plan for the supportive housing. What type of services are required, and if we're going to dictate, I guess, and this is getting into my opinion probably a little bit more than I probably should be at this juncture, but if we're going to be trying to define for the provider what type of services should be provided, that's probably out of our area of expertise. And so I think that leaving it to the current code so that we can have those addressed on a case-by-case basis based on the provider's understanding, which is probably going to be greater than our own, to try and dictate what services should be provided on site.
Thank you.
I think my opinion on this might just show my lack of complete understanding, but it seems as though if we are providing appropriate access to transit for the project, that this is somewhat of a non-issue, that if they have access to transit, then they will have access then to social services and everything else they might need. So I would lean toward A, that if the provision for access to transit is there, then they will then have access to social services as well.
Commissioner Zelinski?
Relative to this issue and also the issue of proximity to transit, we heard some comments tonight about paratransit. And I'm thinking it might be useful to me, and I suspect to others on this commission, if we got some information about paratransit availability and access.
Sure.
Yeah, which can.
My thoughts on this particular proximity to social services is I tend to agree with what Alan was saying in terms of the people who will actually have to, and this is part of the code, they have to put together a management plan in which they identify the services that are needed and how they're going to provide for those. And I think the professionals who are experts in developing supportive housing and putting programs together are much more capable than any city code could be at providing for those needs. So my inclination is to keep the code as is on this one.
I would agree, because if they're building supportive housing, doesn't it by definition include some support, some services, and those would be unique to whatever project they are, and they're going to be inherent in what they're doing anyway. So adding additional definitions and requirements seems kind of redundant and probably overly prescriptive, in my opinion.
I agree.
I think we have some consensus on number 8. Let's move along to number 9, the project review process. Again, this one is probably likely related to what's decided on option number 1, but comments, further comments?
We're moving on to 9?
Just dealt with proximity to social services.
Right, so we're moving on, right?
Right.
Yeah, I definitely support option A.
Oh, okay.
Likewise.
Agreed.
Alan, just to clarify for the record, currently, the way the code's written, it's the hearing examiner review, right? Not director review.
For single-family zones, that is correct. For multifamily and commercial zones, it's director review.
Okay, thank you.
Alan, if the hearing examiner, do they have an additional opportunity after that?
The hearing examiner's decision is a final decision unless it's appealed.
And
And that appeal would go to Superior Court.
Superior Court.
Correct.
And so what keeps it out of city council?
Keeping it the way it is with the hearing examiner review, the council will have no role in reviewing the project permits.
I guess where I'm going is, I think all controversial issues are gonna end up in city council.
Not necessarily. I mean, most of our permits, council will never seize under the current code.
I understand most, but I'm talking about the controversial ones.
The only things that go to the city council are projects that are subject to comprehensive plan amendment and rezone with a development agreement. And so in the case of something like this, it would never get to the city council unless you change the review process away from the hearing examiner. And there are no, there's only one land use in our code that is reviewed by the city council as opposed to the hearing examiner, and that's the siting of aircraft landing and takeoff facilities.
I guess where I'm coming from, if I go back in history, Berkshire was city council.
No, it was not. It was that was approved by the hearing examiner.
So the meetings at city council
Were about the code amendment and mostly just public input at regular city council meetings about their opinions of the siting of that site, of that building and that use.
Okay.
Commissioner Yanusak?
Is it permitted, or is there any precedent for the city council to, I guess, provide comment during the hearing examiner process, as far as just like any other member of the public, or for individual
I don't
council
know.
members to do that?
I don't think that it is barred by any city ordinance. It'd be highly unusual, though.
So we are in agreement that for project review process, we'll leave it with the hearing examiner, depending on what happens with other parts of the code. Okay. So moving on to number 10, definition of supportive housing. Does anybody have any amendments they would like to make to the current definition?
As I mentioned earlier, we may come back with a recommendation for some tweaking of the definition, but we wanted to hear what staff, or excuse me, the commission and public had to say tonight.
Does the commission have comments on that?
I just have one. I mean, it's so new, we don't know. These might be the best thing in the world, and we, when will we, or what mechanism would we use to change that if there are positive things that come out of the third and fourth and fifth one of these, or negative things that come out of the third and fourth?
Typically, if we learn of a problem, if it's something that can't be dealt with administratively just by changing how we review things that don't require an amendment to the code, we'll do things that way. If they're, for example, things that we would require for a management plan, that's more of an administrative requirement that we can deal with during a permit process. But if it's something that requires amending the code to fix a problem, then when we learn the problem, we'll bring it forward to put it in front of the commission and council for consideration of an amendment.
Thank you.
I do have a question about the definition. As written, is supportive housing intended to provide long-term rather than transitional housing for all three of the populations noted?
Not necessarily. I mean,
Okay.
for homeless people, that don't have a disability or, some other reason that they can't transition to, non-supportive housing, then, that's one of the reasons we would want to make a change to that definition.
So it seems everyone's comfortable with the current definition unless staff needs to tweak it because of some other changes somewhere in the code. Is that? Okay, moving on to option number 11, open space and green space. Does anybody have comments on this particular, these options?
I'd support a case-by-case, decide on a case-by-case basis.
I would too.
I would agree with that.
I agree.
I would agree with that. However, I think it should be on a case-by-case basis based on the needs of the residents as well as in the context of the neighborhood. I think that open space is not just to provide refuge for those on site, but also to be in context with the surrounding neighborhood.
Good point. Okay. Number 12, I think it's been established that we can enforcement of conditions. So we'll move on to number 13, impacts to the neighborhood. And I think this is the last one, so we kind of end and begin with the same question. And it sounds like maybe what we're looking at is 2 draft resolutions. I don't know. I've given my thoughts on Commissioner Zelinski.
Yeah, my thought on this after hearing the testimony we've heard tonight, or the comments, is that it's probably appropriate to ask for some sort of a neighborhood impact analysis on any project, regardless of whether it's in the single-family zone or not, because that would allow us to get at the issue of, is it within or near a historic district? What about the impacts on neighborhood open space if the property that's being used is actually being used informally as open space? Those kinds of issues could then come into that kind of a statement, and I think it's appropriate, even if we end up recommending no more single family.
Through the conditional use. I like that. Commissioner?
I think it's a good point. I guess my concern is that in non-single-family neighborhoods, those kinds of studies just add more cost to supportive housing. And so I guess my inclination is to really hold my opinion on what you just said until we understand better as to the direction of the Planning Commission on whether or not to allow supportive housing in single-family zone areas.
I would agree. I think that, and maybe I'm still not quite getting the concept, but the idea of carving out a separate definition, description of supportive housing in a multifamily or commercial zone that's already in existence doesn't seem like really much of a necessity at all. You could already do that. You don't need necessarily a special category. The only time you need a special category for this is if you're doing it in a single-family zone. And if that is the case, then I think you do need to treat it differently, so it's not a one size. Right, so, I don't know, I mean, it's a tough issue. I mean, like I said, coming back from the end where we began, I mean, in a sense, I think maybe we really are only having here because of this carve out for this in single-family zones, and that really is the issue, because we wouldn't need to have this conversation because you could already do all of this in a multifamily commercial zone with no special regulations.
I think you have hit it in the fact that what is the purpose of supportive housing, the definition of supportive housing? Why was that created? Why was that defined? Because you're correct, you can go ahead and do these in multifamily zones. And I think the history of supportive housing in the city will probably give the answer to why that occurred.
So piggyback on what you said, I would say why we don't need to impose any additional requirements on somebody with doing something they can already do pretty much in a commercial or residential zone. Really, we're only talking about what are we going to do about if we're going to do something, or recommend or endorse continuing this in a single family zone.
And Alan can correct me if I'm wrong, and I may be, but it sounds as though the distinction between supportive housing in non-single family zones and a otherwise normal project is potentially lower parking requirements and the requirement for a plan review so that that supportive housing development is hopefully successful going forward.
Major difference is the off-street parking requirement. But then this code amendment did add some additional things like the management plan and some of the things that we've been talking about tonight that weren't previously applicable to supportive housing projects in multifamily zones because we didn't distinguish between supportive housing and multifamily housing. Now they're subject to more requirements than they were prior to 2016.
Commissioner Walden?
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on the ordinance or the code. I believe I mentioned this last meeting. I really think requiring 24-hour manager on every type of supporting housing just is kind of not necessary. Depends on the type of housing.
And that would go to the management plan again, and requiring a management plan to define what the services are and things of that nature.
But the code says it's required like for all of them.
No, I completely understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point that you're pulling out there.
Okay.
Commissioner Zelinski?
I just have a question on supportive housing in commercial and multifamily zones. Is it limited to only to publicly owned properties?
No.
Okay.
So I guess with regard to 13, I guess I'm kind of drawn to option C, which specifically says that we're going to treat supportive housing differently, perhaps, on single-family zones than otherwise.
Right.
And I guess in my opinion, I guess maybe getting to the ultimate question that maybe we weren't going to talk about, but I guess I would say generally I can see maybe that it could be a good thing in certain circumstances to have this as an option, because certainly we talked about availability. These opportunities don't come up very often. And if an opportunity does come up, if it happens to be in a single-family zone, it's something that I think is worth considering and maybe being able to pursue. But I guess my view is it does need to be very prescriptive, and it's very important that it get locked down tight, that it is in fact going to be something that's compatible with the neighborhood, not that's going to have the impacts that people that we've heard are going to, that's going to be effectively be able to mitigate all that, and it is going to be compatible with the neighborhood. And in my mind, I would think that might frequently mean that the project couldn't go ahead because you're not going to build a project you're not going to build 3 houses on a lot. You want to be able to bring in the density that I think is maybe inherently incompatible with a single-family neighborhood. And I could be wrong because I don't know what any particular project is, but that would be for another discussion, I suppose. But I could certainly see that being supportive of a project in a supportive housing project in a single-family zone, depending on what the project was and what it looked like. Certainly not building a Berkshire, or not the Berkshire, but the Claire's Place, tower, or size something in a neighborhood. But if it was on a much smaller scale and fit in well and didn't have these negative impacts, I see value in having that as an option available, even though it may not be practical for the service providers. I don't know.
I mean, I think that in the hypothetical, I agree with you. Because I think we could craft language to appropriately address contextual scale, lot coverage, density, all the design standards that we require in single-family zones. So I think in the abstract, that makes sense. I think that we've also been provided with some good information on the property that may be applicable to developing supportive housing in single-family zones. And it appears that, you know, there aren't many. There are 4. One is already developed by the Everett Housing Authority as 22 units. One isn't terribly buildable, and 2 are in a historic overlay. So I think it's up to the commission as to which route they take, but I think effectively the result is the same.
Any other comments? I would agree with what Commissioner Finch identified. And I would also note that the 2 properties that are eligible are less than 500. They're really close in proximity to each other as well. So, is that helpful?
That's very helpful. I'll be bringing you something back that based upon the feedback that I've heard tonight. I'm not sure exactly what it'll look like, but you may have.
Come on, Alan.
You may have a 2-option kind of decision put in front of you.
Bring us one, baby, bring us one.
Thank you. All right, I think we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Way to use that gavel there.